Okay. Well, thank you all. And thanks, Ron. It's great to see your face. Haven't seen you for a while.
Great to be here, and it's great to see all of you.
And great. And Justine. And then the other Joan, who I don't know which Joan you are, but wonderful. I have just a real short little opening for us tonight, something to center. And it comes from a prayer service for supporting Occupy Together from the Interfaith Worker Justice Center. They say, we stand on the side of love with the 99%. We want a society that works for 100%. How we care for one another is a moral question. How we divide the nation's prosperity is an ethical question. How we witness to injustice is a faith question. So let us do our part in creating a vision for a more just America. So just something to center us today. For those of you visiting or seeing the recording, I was just telling folks that this is a picture from last Wednesday at the Ohio State House. It was the 10th. Yeah, that was the 10th, wasn't it, of April. And this was the aftermath of the vote on Senate Bill 25 in the House. That is the 6-week abortion ban.
23, Joan.
20, okay. Oh,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. 23, yes. The 6-week abortion ban. And then this is another picture of the State House, the foyer outside of the House chamber where they were voting. And that's the door through which the legislators were going to be walking the walk of shame in just a few moments. And yes, the chant was shame, shame, shame. Mm. So just to give you some idea of what it was looking like with the hundreds and hundreds of people that were there. So, Justine, you want to start us off with...
Yeah, I mean, Joan kind of said it all. The 6-week abortion ban passed on August 10th and then was signed into law by Governor DeWine on April 11th. It's very interesting to know that this bill passed, and this bill passed so fast, even after Larry Householder, who the Democrats elected into the position of House Speaker, and who said that abortion bills weren't a priority, still managed to have this passed. And so I just think it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition when I think there was some hope on the Democratic side that Larry Householder would not put this at the top of the agenda, and that hasn't happened. So what the bill does, I pulled out a nice cheat sheet, fact sheet that the Cleveland.com put together, and it provides that doctors or anyone who performs an abortion without doing a ultrasound to determine if there's a heartbeat will be subject to a 5th-degree felony, and they could have 6 to 12 months behind bar and a $2,500 court fine. There would also be further disciplinary action for doctors on the medical board. They could lose their license to practice. There could be medical board fines in addition to court fines. There are no rape or incest exceptions. I believe it was it's Senator Antonio, right? No, not Rep. Senator Antonio at one point had introduced a amendment to allow for such exceptions, and that did not pass.
No.
There is an exception to preserve the health of a woman, but there'd be a lot of red tape and a lot of acknowledgments to even have that happen. And so there'll be still some, I think it's going to be a real chilling effect on even abortions in the context where it would preserve the health of a mother. Yes. And then women can sue the abortion providers for wrongful death under the bill, and a doctor can't use legal justification that the measure was unconstitutional unless another court has already ruled that is unconstitutional. And disturbingly, ultrasounds can be abdominal or transvaginal, which is just another indignity that a woman has to suffer in order to obtain an abortion. And we have to remember that 6 weeks is before many women even know that they are pregnant. Mm-hmm. So this is in effect a total abortion ban. And because we are, people of faith, I thought it was really interesting to note that Representative Janine Boyd, who is from Cleveland Heights and a ranking member on the committee, had introduced an amendment to acknowledge that different religions consider life at beginning at different times. You know, some believe it begins at conception, but not all faiths do. And another, the chair of the committee, Rep. Murrin, said on the record that this bill has nothing to do with religious issues. However, and then said, I'm sorry, that this bill has to do with protecting the unborn. But it bears noting that earlier in that same hearing, he, in defeating another amendment where women could have had abortions where there's a fetal abnormality, the chairman of the board said that we are all made in the image of God. So, a little hypocrisy for you, but I thought was something to note. You know, religion is used as both a sword and a shield in this debate, and
and there were a number of witness testimonies in the lead up to the vote, both in the Senate and in the House, and they were incredibly crowded with opponents, some proponents, of course, but many opponents, 40 in one afternoon, which went well into the late hours of that afternoon. And the idea of it being a matter of different religious worldviews was reiterated by a number of us, because there were many, many clergy that were testifying as opponents to this bill as well. So that point that it was a matter of religion was religious worldview was made over and over and over again, but was not heard, deliberately not heard. So,
do you know which denominations might have been represented by those clergy?
Oh, yes. Well, there were several of us UUs.
Yeah.
There were UCC. There were Jewish folk, 3 rabbis that were there.
Oh.
There were a couple from the Disciples and the Lutheran on the very long afternoon. And there were several other religious denominations. I don't know how many on the shorter afternoon.
Well, that's good. That's good. Yeah.
So it was contentious.
So, Joan, what's that a picture of?
That is a picture of the gallery around the House during the debate in the House and the vote on the Senate Bill 23. And that is just 2 sides and how packed we were in there. Standing room only, which frankly wasn't even allowed. People started sitting on everybody else's lap just to stay in the gallery. But that is at the same time that people were outside with the signs chanting. So that just gives you some idea, once again, of how many people there were in opposition or in support of the bill going down in the vote, but in opposition to the ban.
And it's important to note that the ACLU has already vowed to challenge the bill. So I think we can expect that to come around. And then I wanted to talk that this, unfortunately, the 6-week abortion ban is not the only abortion-related bill that is currently making its way through the Ohio legislature. I wanted to provide some updates on 2 other bills that are currently making their way through.
Could I ask about this one before we go on?
Yeah.
Was this one an ALEC bill? SB 23?
I don't know that for a fact, but given how many, it is definitely a model bill. Whether it's from ALEC, which we're definitely going to be talking about, I don't know that for a fact.
It's a model bill, but it might, might be from something else.
Yeah, because there's been a number that have been passed. This is just part of a wave. I mean, Joan, do you know if it's an ALEC bill?
I know that it was in consultation, but the bill itself was proposed several years ago. And it's been proposed every year, every legislative session for several years in a row by a woman named Porter. But it was not until this year that the governor felt that there was a chance of it actually going forward and making it to the Supreme Court. In previous years, Governor Kasich would said, I'm not going to sign this thing. It's going to waste a lot of our time and our money if we, pass this, and then we have to go forward with all the court cases. Well, Governor DeWine says, well, now, since we've got a wonderful, favorable Supreme Court, let's go forth with it and spend the money and bundle it up with the other states that are passing very similar legislation.
Yeah.
The fact that they are all based on the same language now may mean that they were just using Ohio's as a model, but it may also mean that it was assisted in its crafting by ALEC.
Yeah.
Don't know which.
Okay. Thank you.
So Senate Bill 27 is also making its way through the Ohio Senate. It passed, and now it's on its way to the House. It passed the Senate committee on March 26th, and then a full session of the Senate on March 27th. It was voted up 27 yeas and 7 nays. And this is a bill that would require the interment or cremation of fetal remains. And it is viewed as just another measure to basically burden abortion clinics. If a woman does not choose cremation or interment of the fetal remains, byproduct of the abortion, then the abortion clinic has to decide and also foot the bill. It's important to note that if a woman miscarries at the same stage that an abortion would be performed, that the remains or the byproduct is still considered medical waste and would be treated as such. So this is a bill that specifically burdens abortion clinics and does not similarly burden hospitals. So if this was about respecting life, I think you wouldn't see it so narrowly targeted.
Right.
And then HB 90 is a bill that is entitled Spread Information to Protect Humanity of Unborn Child, as you may remember, and it provides and dictates a curriculum that, quote unquote, regards the humanity of the unborn child and talks about life beginning at conception. One of the most recent changes to this bill as it works its way through is that it was amended to require that schools implement the curriculum, not just making the curriculum optional. So that means that you're taking away rights from the local school boards and local teachers and districts to implement that piece of the educational requirement and instead mandating it. So again, we're going to keep watching that bill.
That seems like religious teaching in public schools. That seems completely unconstitutional.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not, it's not overtly religious in that they're supposed to just develop instructional programming that respects or talks about the humanity of the unborn child. But there is definitely at least, ethics and philosophy that is built into the curriculum. And of course, the bill doesn't spell out the curriculum. It then leaves that the requirement to put that together to the state bureaucracy, so that the Ohio Department of Education would be tasked with creating this curriculum, and there would be a certain disclosures that then have to be provided. But then making the curriculum mandatory is, especially when you consider conservatives have a view on the world that small government and school choice and the ability to define educational parameters, this kind of dictating of curriculum seems to fly in the face of that. So it's just an interesting bill to be watching. And again, another assault on a woman's privacy and substantive due process rights.
Well, and it does assume a particular worldview that can be argued that it is a religious worldview. And that will be an interesting argument to watch.
Yeah. So I wanted to back up a little bit. I know we were focused on Ohio and on Ohio specific bills, but I think that the passage of the 6-week abortion ban and other developments in other states, it's an interesting time to talk about what could happen next, given what could happen at the United States Supreme Court if things wind up the way that Ohio would like it to. And that is that we're going to see at least some people there's a really good slate.com piece, which is linked in the notes that are provided there, that talk about, they call it the terrifying rise of the abortion abolition movement. And it's talking about how right now in Texas, lawmakers are hearing testimony that would classify abortion as a homicide and could subject women to capital punishment in connection with having an abortion. And the capital punishment would be triggered because homicide in Texas qualifies as a death penalty capital crime. So while the bill doesn't say, if you have an abortion, you will receive the death penalty, it is abortion as a homicide. Homicides are capital crimes in Texas. And as we remember from the Trump campaign in 2016, when he said that women should be punished for having an abortion, abortion rights groups at the time were quick to correct Trump and note that the purpose of these bills and provisions wasn't to punish women. It was to, save the quote unquote unborn child. But I think we're going to keep on discovering that is going to be less and less the case. This author, Christina, I don't even know how to say her next name, Catarucci, notes that an undercurrent of judgment and a desire for retribution has always coursed beneath the surface of the anti-abortion movement, and it's impossible to reconcile a worldview in which abortion is murder, but the 500,000 U.S. women who get abortions each year have done nothing wrong. So I guess I just wanted to highlight that as something to watch and something that I think that people of faith can speak on actively and with conviction about how this is not okay.
And there is another bill that is in formation right now. I believe it's in the Ohio Senate. I don't think it's the House, but it would deny insurance coverage for all non-therapeutic abortions. And non-therapeutic is defined such that it would not include abortions for rape or incest. So denial of insurance is another way.
And I think that bill, I didn't put it on here, and I don't know why, Joan, but I think that bill also defines non-therapeutic abortion as any birth control that prevents implantation of an egg.
Yes.
So that it applies more broadly than to just the surgical abortion, right, or medical abortion as we know it. It would apply to other forms IUDs, of birth control, IUDs, and it would be yes, and it would be really interesting to see how that relates to Obamacare and if there's a preemption issue as it relates between the two, which mandates insurance coverage for birth control and contraceptives.
That's another one.
Yeah.
So I want to do a quick update on criminal justice reform measures. And I guess the bottom line is there's not a ton of updating to discuss since the last webinar. SB 3 is still in committee. Excuse me. SB 3 is the comprehensive criminal justice reform bill that was touted by Republicans as being in their top 10 of priority pieces of legislation. Despite that fact, it took a substantial amount of time for the bill to even be drafted and introduced into the Senate and then referred to committee, and no hearings have occurred since March 6th. And given the flurry of activity we saw in late March and early April, it is notable that nothing has occurred on this bill. Similarly, the SB 13, which is the bill that would outlaw the shackling and solitary confinement of pregnant inmates, is also sitting in committee. It had its first hearing on March 13th, and no other hearings have taken place. Similarly, HB 54 and HB 136, it's the same bill. It would prohibit the death penalty if the offender had a serious mental illness at the time that the aggravated murder or crime occurred. So it basically is if you had a serious mental illness at the time you committed a crime, you would not be subject to the death penalty. This bill had its first hearing in the House on April 11th, but the Senate bill, SB 54, was referred to committee in February and hasn't even had a first hearing. Mm-hmm. It's, I guess, good to note that there's a bill in both the House and the Senate on the same issue, and it seems to have bipartisan support. So I'm hopeful this bill will have momentum, but we haven't seen a lot of updates on that yet.
No.
And then The same SB 99 and SB 100, which would eliminate mandatory bindovers from juvenile to adult court and ensure that people that committed crimes as juveniles would be eligible for parole. Neither of those bills have even had a first hearing yet. So they are introduced, nothing's happened. I've also been searching for updates on the Ohio Supreme Court's bail task force and anything coming out of that task force, and I have nothing to report. The website hasn't even been updated to reflect the March meeting and any materials or discussions that occurred at that meeting. And I also have no update on Governor DeWine's halting of the death penalty. He did that earlier this year in response to an opinion from a magistrate judge that found the death penalty protocol in Ohio constituted or amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. So in response to that bill, even though the judge didn't halt executions per se, Governor DeWine did for review of the protocol. Nothing has been reported on it, but I do want to talk about just briefly HB 85, which passed the House in April with overwhelming support. It only had 2 nay votes, and it was interesting from 2 very conservative Republicans were the only 2 nay votes. And that bill would fund death penalty prosecutions in Pike County, Ohio. Ohio has a very uneven capital punishment enforcement. Counties with money, Cuyahoga, Franklin, Hamilton, will actually prosecute death penalty cases. If you commit a crime in a rural area in Ohio, it is very unlikely you'll be subject to the death penalty. But there was a pretty heinous crime in Pike County that it's called the Roden homicides, where basically a family of I'm sorry, I didn't write it down. It's either 6 or 8 people were basically killed execution style by another family. So this bill would fund the death penalty prosecutions of those homicides. And I think it's a micro versus macro question. It's one thing to not believe in the death penalty on paper or to say that it's being overused, but then when faced with a heinous crime like that, I think that there's the vengeance kicks in, and then want for revenge or retribution kicks in. So I just think it's interesting when we have no executions in Ohio right now because we're reviewing death penalty protocols, but we're now passing special bills to fund special prosecutions.
Yeah. So many of the elements in the criminal justice reform seem to be put on the back burner, or else even in the refrigerator, while everybody worked on the budget these last couple of weeks. And the budget has been a major part, that and destroying women's health care.
Yes, exactly. And it's interesting to note, I didn't mention this, that we need to keep, I'm going to be keeping an eye out for whether either SB 27 or HB 90 are tucked into the budget bill. It has happened in the past where anti-abortion bills are tucked into these must-pass budget bills, and there is some inklings that may happen again. So it'll be interesting to see. And HB 85 could also, that's a bill that could be tucked in as well. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. And then there's Senate Bill 33.
Yes, which Joan, do you mind if I read your quote, or do you want to read your quote?
No, go right ahead.
Are you sure?
Sure.
Joan had the distinct honor of testifying against SB 33, and I took this quote out of her testimony that I thought was particularly powerful. And what she said was, "This bill attacks freedom of religion and prohibits justice-oriented faith traditions from exercising what they believe is their religious duty to engage in public witness at those places where the health and life of people are endangered and the sacred integrity of the environment is put in jeopardy." And for those who don't know, SB 33 is the so-called critical infrastructure bill, and this is an ALEC bill. Yeah. This is a bill, this is model legislation, this is anti-protester legislation that has passed in other states, and is a direct response to the pipeline protests that occurred at Standing Rock. And it subjects nonprofits to substantial criminal penalties and fines. So it's not even the person that's engaged in the protest, it's any organization that engages people in these kinds of protests. And it would be apply to nonviolent peaceful protests that occur on critical infrastructure. There's a great concern that it's overbroad in its breadth and could apply to someone who's even standing in their backyard over a natural gas easement that's in there, in their own property. So this one is getting attention. SB 33 had its second hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee on March 20th, its third hearing on April 3rd, and its fourth hearing on April 10th. There was a possible vote out of committee after the fourth hearing. It did not happen. It's also interesting to note that testimony on this bill has been limited to 3 or 5 people speaking, and then the rest via written testimony. So a bill that is seeking to suppress the rights of people to engage in a fundamental exercise of their constitutional right to assemble and protest is also prohibiting the free speech of reaching their legislators.
I do have some update on that because we talked to a couple of the Senate aides on April 10th after the hearing was over. Now, the first hearing on March 20th, where they had the proponents speak, there was no limit on those guys. And you can see it actually online where they have statement after short statement from people from the oil and gas industry. And they're all wonderful little statements saying, we need this bill, please vote for it, period. Then when we started to see opponent testimony coming in, the third and the fourth hearing, the third hearing was limited to 5 people, period. And the April 10th was limited to 8 people, which is hardly even touching the matter. And we have heard from an aide that there will be another hearing. And the promise at that point on April 10th was that there would be unlimited testimony at that point. So I know that the Buckeye Environmental Network, which I know, Ron, that you know well, has already been talking about how to line up the best testimony for that, the best oral arguments for that. There's already dozens and dozens and dozens of written testimony, written statements already turned in. But they're trying to pass this off in the hearings, especially when speaking to the opponents. The senators are saying, "Oh, this is just, a nothing bill. We're just taking basic trespassing and, well, giving it a few sharper edges because we want to protect people from critical infrastructure attacks." Well, of course, as we know, there's nothing in here about terrorism or, doing anything that, we already have trespassing laws, but this is something that creates felonies out of what were misdemeanors. And very vague language, if you've read the bill, which is outrageously long, talking about not only tampering as a felony, but intent to tamper as a felony. Yes, intent to tamper as a felony. And then, of course, organizations can be complicit, whatever that may mean, in supporting people who are tampering or intending to tamper. And if they're complicit, then organizations can be fined at 10 times the rate of the felony. So $100,000 here, $100,000 there. Pretty soon you have, bankrupted the Sierra Club and churches and UU Justice Ohio and UU Ministry for the Earth and a few other, and the FACT. Yeah, exactly.
Did you know that Chairman Eklund, I think it was Teresa Mills that told me this when we were in the midst of arranging the testimony. She said after the first time it was limited to 5, several people complained. Mm-hmm. And Chairman Eklund apparently said he would allow more opponent testimony the next time if the opponents behaved themselves. That's their attitude. Mm-hmm. We're terrorists. They're looking at us sitting there. we're the terrorists, I guess. That's what they're thinking.
In the little clerical collar with the...
Yeah, you're a terrorist.
Yeah. I'm a terrorist.
Well, and it's interesting because in the first time a bill is introduced, the person that's sponsoring the bill sets forth why they want the bill. And in the first packet here, they attach, I can't remember which organization, saying we want to protest some pipeline, and they call themselves anarchists, and this is supposed to be a scare tactic. Some flyer from some small organization wanting to exercise some free speech rights and call themselves anarchists is the reason we need this giant bill that's completely overbroad.
Yep. This thing is insidious. This thing is scary.
Yeah, I like the point that maybe it was Joan that made it, but I read so much testimony I can't remember who said what. But the idea that you can't criminalize, you shouldn't try to criminalize an organization. If an individual commits a crime, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. But to tar somebody with the label of terrorist, just because they're demonstrating, we have like one of our members who's clergy. She's a black minister in Youngstown, Reverend Monica Beasley Martin. She often does prayer vigils at injection well sites.
Right.
And we were talking about this. They could arrest you. They could arrest they could fine your church.
Yep.
They could fine FACT because you're a member of FACT. I mean, where do you draw the line? There is no line.
This one is skating under the radar too. We had a number of UU Justice Ohio folk there on April 10th. Because we'd been speaking about it, and at our April 6th spring gatherings that were in 5 different cities, Nikki Antonio talked about Senate Bill 33 and how she was incredibly surprised that it was gaining any kind of momentum because she thought it was really dangerous, maybe the most dangerous bill that we had so far before the legislature. And so we had a number of us there on April 10th. And I think that they all agreed that, this is not getting the kind of publicity, this is not getting the kind of notice that it needs.
And yet it's moving in the legislature. We saw this introduced last session, and it was Senate Bill 250, and it didn't get a lot of momentum. It was introduced late in the session. It didn't move out of committee. There weren't a lot of hearings, and this session we're seeing it really pick up steam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, at Standing Rock, around the time of Standing Rock, maybe even it was a little before Standing Rock, there were people in the industry that were organizing. They were organizing, paramilitary veterans or special op veterans, and they had these meetings, and they said that we've got to target these people as terrorists, meaning the anti-oil and gas people. We've got to target them and label them as terrorists. I mean, this is a deliberate strategy that they're following, I think.
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, but that's one example of what you're talking about, the ALEC bills.
Yes. And I want to quickly juxtapose Senate Bill 33 against House Bill 156. House Bill 156, instead of criminalizing or subjecting nonprofits to civil liability, would now grant immunity from civil liability to nonprofits where a gunman entered the premises or was at an event and committed an act where people were injured or died. So if someone has a gun on a nonprofit's premises or at an event, now the nonprofit is immune from liability if this bill passes. So it's a nonsensical world we live in. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, it's a good juxtaposition.
You really wonder what the worldview is of some of these members of the General Assembly. I've actually lobbied, met Eklund, and he's my state senator. So in a group, we lobbied with him here in Mentor, and he seems to be I hate to describe somebody this way, but he really did not seem to be open to any of our ideas at all. It was just like he had his agenda and that was it. He sat there and listened, but he wouldn't agree to anything or any points that we made. It was very hopeless dealing with him.
Mm-hmm. Well, I kind of wondered, listening to the way the senators were fielding questions and testimony from opponents of Senate Bill 33. I really wondered whether the senators had ever read the thing themselves.
That's a good point, because when we were in Columbus several years ago, we had testified, we had actually been involved in proposing an alternate oil and gas law, a reform of the entire oil and gas part of the law, Section 1509 of the ORC. And we had certain, things, certain aspects that we knew. We knew our own legislation really well because we had gone over it and over it and over it. And these people on the committee misstated things. They were way off on things. And they said, your bill does this and this. Well, no, it doesn't. Where did you get that? It's like, and obviously they had not read it. They didn't know anything about it.
No.
And another member of the General Assembly, who was our he's our state representative, Ron Young. I lobbied with him a few years ago and talking about fracking, and he accepted some of our points, the points about property rights. He accepted that, but not health and not environment, nothing like that. He said, well, I can see your thing, at least on the property rights thing. I said, well, then do you think you could support some legislation restricting things and making things better? He said, oh, no, I can't. He said, I can't do that because he said, I have to do what my caucus says. I have to do what my caucus. And he was a veteran member of the General Assembly. I mean, he's been in there for years. He was a state senator, and then because he couldn't run again, he was term limited, then he ran for state rep and got that position.
Yeah.
And then he told us, he said, it's fun. He said, my daughter wrote a paper about fracking. And we said, well, what was her position? Oh, she's totally against it. And I thought, where are you coming from? His own daughter was, I don't know.
This is probably a good segue then into the discussion around ALEC, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. The root of the problem, right?
Yeah, so as some of you may know, USA Today did a whole analysis on ALEC and ALEC bills, and I pulled this infographic from that reporting that talks about model legislation in Ohio. And what they found was that there are 15 bills that resembled ALEC legislation, 15 bills resembled the American Legislative and Issue Campaign Exchange, which is ALICE. And the most frequent category in Ohio for model bills was abortion. And the second most popular was healthcare and drug policy. Mm-hmm. So Ohio is a state where we're seeing ALEC bills get introduced and get passed. And the reason that we're finding ALEC bills in particular is because while ALEC is a nonpartisan organization, their board is entirely Republican, and they work best when there is a Republican-controlled legislature and a Republican governor, because once that happens, they can get these bills passed. And so, ALEC is a nonprofit, technically nonpartisan organization that leans very conservative, and it crafts and standardizes conservative and pro-business policies. The bulk of its funding, which is about $8 million a year, is from corporations and conservative groups or foundations. And because of the sources of its funding, the bills tend to naturally have the policy priorities of those corporations and conservative think tanks. These special interests effectively turn ALEC into lawmakers turn ALEC's lawmakers into stealth lobbyists, providing them with talking points, signaling how they should vote, and collaborating on bills affecting hundreds of issues. And that was from reporting of Mike McIntyre from the New York Times in describing ALEC and what ALEC does. And it's interesting that ALEC has been chaired by Democrats in the past, but one of those former chairs, who was Iowa Representative Dolores Mertz, has since publicly blasted the group as being overly partisan. So you have a nonprofit, a nonpartisan group fundraising $8 million a year, and the sole purpose of this group is to craft model legislation. There is reporting from legislators who say, no, we don't read the bills, no, we don't write the bills, we leave that to the smarter people than us. And it's interesting comments from these legislators when they've been elected to draft legislation,
Yeah.
and understand legislation and implement legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And so top issues are tort reform, supporting the Keystone Pipeline, repealing Obamacare, criminalizing certain behavior, anti-abortion bills. And they've also promoted bills on gun rights, voter IDs, and immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And these bills have been at some of the biggest state controversies that we've seen. And so it's interesting that ALEC, I had not heard of ALEC before, and I consider myself a pretty informed citizen. And it's interesting what the focus has been. And the natural question is, do the Democrats or the liberals have any answer to ALEC? And largely, no. There is not an organization out there that supports state level bills for a couple of reasons. One, Democrats haven't been focused on state legislatures to the same degree that Republicans have been. And two, there simply isn't the same infrastructure or fundraising, either ability, efforts, or cohesion to get momentum and have an answer to ALEC.
Or desire to create that kind of cookie cutter legislation across all the states. I mean, that's not been part of the culture.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because if the legislators are doing their job, they should look at what's important for their individual state. They shouldn't be copying model legislation.
Right.
Doesn't make sense.
Well, and it's interesting because the idea of federalism is to make the states the cookie, not the cookie cutter, but the brainchild for new experiments, right? They are an incubator for legislation. They are places where you can try out new things. It's interesting, conservatives believe in, small government, or at least profess to believe in small government. And this seems to be an anti-democratic, anti-small government move to have states pass uniform bills across state lines in that manner.
Mm-hmm. And the work of the policy analysts at the state level has changed. Years ago, when I was doing my doctoral work in policy analysis, state policy analysts, were these guys that were in the basement of the state house, till all hours of the day and night, doing analysis and ideas and, feeding information up to the legislators.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're not there that much. There are legislative aides still employed, and there are analysts who take this legislation already created and they tweak it a little bit and summarize it and then explain it to the legislators. But they're not doing the kind of research and writing that used to be part of the job. So that's, well, not in all states, mind you, but in some of them that I've
and in
to.
Some of these states, the legislature are part-time, they're not compensated well, and drafting and crafting bills is a time-consuming hard work. And when someone hands you something and says this bill will achieve X, Y, and Z, and it's in line with what you think your constituents want or you believe in, it's hard to say no, I would think.
And it's easy to cut budget and save money by not hiring all those analysts anymore.
Yeah.
They don't have to do all that work. So it's an interesting turn.
But in a way, it's a anti-small d democratic measure, trend. We'll call it a trend to have one organization centralize, craft the bills, and push it out without the legislatures putting thought, time, and energy into what is good for their state or their constituents.
Yeah, I think too that the consolidation of media is feeding into this, because when you think about all the newspapers, all the smaller town and larger town newspapers that have gone out of existence, some of these communities don't even have a newspaper that they used to have. So the voices of these communities is less prominent now.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so
and it's really. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say they can just sail along on their own and do these things. They're not getting the inputs that they should get from the communities around the state.
Well, and it's really hard sometimes to track where these bills are and what's happening at the State House. I mean, I'm keeping tabs because I spend a lot of time on the Ohio Legislature website, combing through, testimony, going through committee hearings, figuring out when the next agenda is from the next week. Because, the government is open every Friday. It sets out the next week's legislative agenda, what's happening in committees. But, if it wasn't for the State House News Bureau and sometimes the Columbus Dispatch, there'd be no reporting. A lot of, as newspapers have struggled, they've gotten rid of their State House news teams.
Yeah.
And so it's, government is luckily Ohio is pretty transparent. They have more committee hearings on TV than they used to and available on the internet. And they have these resources, but it's time consuming to figure out what is happening at the State House.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes things get missed and sometimes they get changed.
Yes.
Makes it very difficult. Thank you, Justine. This is a really great rundown of all of this. This is very clear, and we can see we've got a very busy spring ahead of us.
Yeah, I'm going to take these 2 weeks of reprieve. We're on spring break.
I haven't met Justine before. Justine, do you do this for UUJO? Is this your job or?
Well, I'm a volunteer. I'm a practicing attorney in Cleveland. I work downtown. And I've been doing, how long have I been doing this, Joan? A year and a little bit more?
About a year, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And it's just wonderful. And she keeps this all updated on the UU Justice Ohio website. By the way, we are getting a new website soon, working on it. But this is always updated there so that we can get the latest and greatest, Justine, and we're incredibly grateful.
Yeah, I like doing it, and I try to, if you go to the UUJO website, list what's happening in committees before it happens. So you'll see sometimes I'll be a couple days ahead of myself on the website just to alert people as to when committee hearings are happening that may be important, especially if Joan's planning to attend. I'll have them up so you guys can follow and hopefully attend. Joan's done a really good job this session of being active and being down there. I'm sure she's exhausted.
I'm sure she is. Yeah.
These 2 weeks are going to be great.
Yeah.
All righty.
Excuse me. This is the other Joan.
Well, hi, Joan.
Hi,
I
Joan.
have a question.
Yes.
Do you have any information about a bill that was introduced that would require schools to alert parents to how to get their children excused from having vaccinations?
I haven't.
No.
I read something that there was a bill, such a bill was introduced in the Ohio legislature, but I have not seen anything about it since.
That one I would think would come to light with
Yeah,
the various.
I am seeing it just based on a Google search. It says it's House Bill 132.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see.
But I know the Health Committee has been so focused on the anti-abortion work that may have been one of those that fell between the cracks.
Yeah, so it's HB 132. It says regards school immunization and requirements exemptions, and it would regarding notice of school child immunization requirements and exemptions. Let's look at the status. It was referred to the House Committee on March 19th.
Yeah.
And had its first hearing on April 2nd.
So it's been introduced and that's it.
Yeah, it's had one hearing.
Yeah. That's the hearing where it's introduced by their sponsors.
Yes.
So no testimony.
So it says, it will require, it's had two hearings. So it had a proponent hearing. But it says it will require schools to post the state vaccination exemptions in the same manner that they post the state vaccination requirements. Which is probably not a good thing for public health.
This makes me think it's another way that Ohio is going backwards quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's sponsored by Representative Manning of District 59. He's in New Middletown, Ohio. And what he's saying is he was made aware of the need for legislation like this when I was approached by a constituent who shared her story. One of her children had previously suffered from a severe reaction to a vaccination, which left her wary about vaccinating her other children. She was told by her school that her children would be unable to attend because they were not vaccinated. When she inquired about exemption, she was told that they did not exist. Whether or not the school district meant any harm by what they told this mother, the information that they provided her, it was simply incorrect. The legislation will ensure that schools provide parents with the proper information about legal and legitimate exemptions that exist under current law.
Okay.
That reminds me, in the testimony on the anti-abortion bill, were there any medical people there?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yes.
Were they? I mean,
Dozens.
I'm sure that I'm sure there were gynecologists there, right?
Oh yes.
Folks.
Mhm.
What was the thrust of their testimony? Basically?
Both opponents and proponents.
Well, there
quite
were both.
frankly. Oh yes.
Oh, really?
Oh yes.
on both
And
sides.
the opponents, in particular, noted how passing this kind of legislation could have a very chilling effect on having any future OBGYN set up shop in Ohio.
I've worried about that. I've read about that
Yeah.
as a concern.
Yeah, so that was a major concern for them because no doctor wants to have their hands tied when they believe that a procedure is necessary for their patient's health and well-being, and to have a possible felony facing them in the, if they do something that they consider medically necessary, is not a good thing. So there is a genuine concern about a loss of OBGYNs, especially in the rural areas.
Do you know if there are organizations lined up to litigate on this, to litigate against this if it passes?
There are the
It's passed, but
the ACLU has already announced it, and
Yeah.
it sounds like Planned Parenthood of Southwest Ohio, preterm Cleveland up here. I would be,
Yeah.
I haven't spoken to Jesse Hill, but Jesse Hill is a professor at Case Western Law School and has been involved in every single case preterm's done in the last 5 years, if not longer. And I actually reached out specifically to the ACLU, to Elizabeth Bonham, one of those staff attorneys, and inquired, and she said yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I've in the past have done some amicus brief work and some work with the ACLU on these issues. So I sent an email that lent my support. So
what about medical?
we'll see.
What about medical organizations like OBGYN people? And
Well, doctors have, abortion provider doctors have standing to sue, just like abortion clinics, with regards to abortion related measures. I don't know if any doctors have signed on. It is hard to get a doctor to sign his or her name on a complaint. It is, you put your name out there in the public record, and abortion providers are persecuted and murdered and become victims of crimes. So in the past, it has been hard to get doctors to sign on to these pieces of litigation. With regards to this bill, considering how it's basically a complete abortion ban, it'll be interesting to see if there are doctors willing to stand up.
Well, and as it makes its way through the courts, of course, NARAL, Planned Parenthood, and others will undoubtedly be joining, or already part of ACLU's push on this. And there may be some individuals, maybe some doctors through that, through those mechanisms would sign.
Yeah. So the ACLU is out there, and they recruit, they not recruit, but they
welcome
have ways of finding, appropriate parties to have standing to sue, and use their resources. So we'll, I'll keep you guys updated if the litigation comes around, and I'll update the UUJO website.
Okay.
Just so we're all aware.
It was interesting that the doctors that were there to oppose the bills, there were some men and some white men, but there were women and women of color doctors on the opponent side. On the proponent side, it was all old white guys. I'm sorry, but it really was all old white guys.
Yeah.
So I found that a fascinating difference in who was testifying on which side of this.
I have to admit, I was taken by surprise when DeWine signed this, because I was kind of lulled into thinking Ohio will never go this far. I said to myself, even Kasich won't sign it. then this happened. I really thought this is a real sign that we are marching backwards quickly in the state, not just on that one, because of that one piece of legislation, but that and other things.
The constellation.
Yeah.
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 Well, and this bill this time around had Ohio Right to Life support. Ohio Right to Life is a powerful lobbyist on this issue, and they didn't support it in the past because they were afraid it wouldn't pass Supreme Court muster. And Kasich is more of a pragmatist than DeWine, I think. And DeWine, is I think this is a personal issue for DeWine, and he's spoken about his pro-life or anti-choice views for a long time, both when he represented us on the federal level and now as governor. And he had a pretty crass response when someone asked him when he signed it about what women were supposed to do now, and what he basically said was that he was going to be funding support for women and mothers and adoption more, and these women can use those. Yeah. So that was his response. Was I am I believe in life beginning at conception, and we will support these women when they have children as well.
Sure. Okay. Now, yes, and the fairies and the unicorns will dance together in the Glen. Anyway, I think we've come to the end of our hour. Any other questions or comments before we close tonight?
Just thank you for everything. Thank you for the information. Really appreciate it.
And thank
Pleasure
you.
to do it. Yeah, and Joan, Joan, I'll put something up on the website about that vaccine bill and put it on my list, because I think it's interesting, especially with the public health crisis we're having with measles. It's something to keep our eyes
watch on. See what else
Thank you.
comes from that. So thank you all, and we will see you next month.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Good
Many
night.
thanks, Justine.